Chapter 2, Sunday, June 28. You're looking at a map that shows unit positions at dawn on the 28th. Units are still pretty scattered, so I'll emphasize them and add labels. Harrisburg is at the top of the map. Baltimore is just off at the bottom right. All 7 of the U.S. Infantry Corps are now on the map, and all 3 U.S. Cavalry divisions. On the Confederate side, see that Ewell's Corps is north and east, marching toward Harrisburg and the Susquehanna River. Hill's Corps started to shift east across South Mountain. Longstreet's Corps was centered around Chambersburg in the Cumberland Valley. Where was Stuart's cavalry division? Oh my. Let's take a look at what General Stuart was doing. Why are we looking at Stuart's raid? Stuart's raid hampered both sides in their effort to move troops to Gettysburg. General Lee lost the services of his cavalry, and General Meade lost his telegraph line. More on all that later. Major General Jeb Stuart was commander of the Army of Northern Virginia's Cavalry Division. According to Philip Lano, on or about June 23, General Lee asked Stuart to go to Frederick and report what Hooker is up to, unquote. What's involved with that? Where was Stuart's division on June 23? See this map, a screen capture from my animation covering Lee's raid into Pennsylvania. See Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and the Potomac River. Stuart is this icon down here. Frederick is up here. The Federal Army was here and moving north. It would be an interesting discussion to talk about how Stuart should carry out an assignment to go to Frederick and report on enemy activities. What General Stuart did was take 3 of the 5 cavalry brigades in his division and, starting about June 25, take off on a raid. He went south around the rear of the Union Army and then north, trying to rendezvous with Ewell's Corps. Stuart was out of touch with General Lee until the afternoon of July 2. June 25 to July 2. Thursday to Thursday, a week. Let's follow Stuart's division, starting on June 25. See a part of my animated map covering Lee's raid into Pennsylvania. The animated map is available on the web if you want to use it. See the list of sources at the end of this video. Starting on June 25, Stuart gathered 3 of his 5 brigades at Salem, Virginia. The other 2 brigades in his division were Robertson's and Jones's brigades. Stuart ordered those 2 to go off and guard the gaps in the Blue Ridge Mountains. For a moment, I'll superimpose this map over the animation. This map shows Robertson's brigade at Ashby's Gap and Jones's brigade at Snicker's Gap. Jones and Robertson were told to stay on Lee's right and rear and keep him, quoting Lano, informed as to Hooker's intentions, unquote. But that didn't happen. Jones and Robertson were in the gaps until June 30, did not stay on Lee's right and rear, and did not inform Lee when the Federal Army crossed the Potomac. Lee, in his written report after the battle, said that because he had no word that the Union Army was across the river, Lee, with disastrous results, assumed the Union Army was still south of the Potomac in Virginia. Back to the animation. Stuart rallied his 3 brigades at Salem on the 25th, and they took off looking for a spot to cross the Potomac and go north. To get around the U.S. Second Corps, Stuart was forced to detour far to the south and finally cross the Potomac at Rouser's Ford early on the 28th, off course and behind schedule. See that Stuart then moved north between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore on his right and the Federal Army on his left. A couple of consequences. Consequence number 1, see the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad connecting Frederick with Baltimore and Washington, D.C. That rail line was the major supply artery, and Frederick was the Federal Army's telegraph terminal. Kent Masterson Brown, in his book Meade at Gettysburg, A Study in Command, described how Stuart's cavalry cut the telegraph line, apparently late on the 28th, Meade's first day in command. According to Brown, the telegraph line was down for 24 to 48 hours. If it was 48 hours, that would be until late on the 30th. The cut interrupted Meade's flow of intelligence from the east. And more on all that later. And consequence number 2, the enemy army was now between Stuart and Lee. Stuart lost contact with Lee's headquarters, so General Lee had little or no information on where the Union Army was moving, and Lee was forced to use infantry units to replace Stuart's cavalry in guarding his army's flanks and rear. See a recording of Union Army movements on the 28th, running in a loop. The Potomac is lower left. Frederick is in the center, here. Colonel Hardee, the messenger from General Halleck, arrived at Meade's headquarters about 3 a.m. General Meade was woke out of a sound sleep and handed the order that made him the new commander of the Army of the Potomac. See here the order, copied from the official records. General Halleck's orders to General Meade told him that, as with General Hooker, the Army of the Potomac was the covering force for Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and the Army of Operation against the invading forces of the rebels, unquote. Meade's formal acceptance was sent to Halleck at 7 a.m. See here where it lays out Meade's plan on that first morning, probably after less than 4 hours on the job. I must move toward the Susquehanna, keeping Washington and Baltimore well covered, unquote. And then Meade promises, when possible, to give battle. See here a map which shows movements on the 28th. And again, as in Chapter 1, these arrows don't show paths, just start and end points. Blue arrows are U.S. cavalry. Red arrows are U.S. infantry. I'm assuming these movements are Meade's orders rather than Hooker's, because this reverses what Hooker was doing the day before. 12th Corps is brought back to the east to join 3 other Union Corps at Frederick, and the 3rd Corps was pushed forward following the Monocacy River to the northeast. Buford's cavalry took over guarding the Army's western flank. Gregg's cavalry moved to cover the eastern flank. The only Confederate division that moved on June 28 was Early's division to York. Why was Lee's army so quiet? I don't know. As I said a moment ago, in his acceptance message to General Halleck, Meade promised to move toward the Susquehanna. That would be northeast. Was Meade buying into Lee's feint to the east? General Lee wanted Meade to move east because it was away from Lee's line of communications. And note this, to the extent that Meade took his army toward the Susquehanna, they would be out of position when the battle started. Toward the Susquehanna is away from Gettysburg. Meade learned on the 28th that Lee's main body was in the Cumberland Valley north of Hagerstown, moving toward the Susquehanna River. Early's division had moved past Gettysburg, headed toward York. Meade worried that Lee might be pushing around his right flank, threatening Baltimore. See a map covering the area from Frederick on the south to York and Chambersburg on the north. Brown wrote that both Generals Meade and Reynolds spotted the turnpike that ran east-west from Chambersburg to York. That east-west turnpike appeared to Meade to be the reference line, or axis, for the disposition of most of Lee's invading forces. Unquote. Brown wrote that Meade decided he needed to move his army closer to that axis. That evening, he sent a note to General Halleck. My intention is now to move tomorrow on 3 lines to Emmitsburg and Westminster. Unquote. Emmitsburg and Westminster are here. As I said a moment ago, Meade worries that Lee might be pushing around his right flank, threatening Baltimore. See this map that shows the problem Meade was facing. The 2 armies started the campaign down south in Virginia at Fredericksburg, facing each other across the river. Lee's army snuck away to the west and got a lead on the Union Army, marching north down the Shenandoah Valley, then crossing the Potomac and continuing north up the Cumberland Valley. See Washington, D.C. and Baltimore here. Hooker needed to stay between Lee's army and those 2 cities. And now General Meade is in command. On June 28, the Union Army is centered around Frederick. The Confederate Army is at Chambersburg, Carlisle, and York. Do you see what Meade is worried about? Both Harrisburg, the state capital, and Baltimore are threatened. I think we see why Meade was inclined to move his army to the northeast. Edwin Coddington, in his book The Gettysburg Campaign, wrote that Meade's greatest fear was that Lee was already at or across the Susquehanna. But then the battle will be fought at Gettysburg. One of Meade's problems on day 2 during the battle was the distances his troops had to march to reach Gettysburg. The 6th Corps was his biggest infantry unit, and on the morning of July 1 was on the Union right flank, all the way out at Manchester. How did they get way out there? Keep that in mind. There are 3 days to go until July 1. See a recording of Army of Northern Virginia movements on June 28. See Harrisburg and Carlisle on the north, York and Gettysburg toward the south, Chambersburg on the east. It was a quiet day for the Army of Northern Virginia. Early's division captured York, and Gordon's brigade from that division continued on to the river, but local militia burned the bridge before Gordon's brigade could cross. General Lee had been hearing for the last week that Hooker's army was moving toward the Potomac. As I said earlier, Lee expected to get notice from General Stuart if the enemy was across the river. And see what Lee wrote in his after-battle report on July 31, and this is copied from the official records. Lee explains the significance of the missing cavalry, the lack of information, and explains why he sent Ewell to the east. No report had been received that the Federal Army had crossed the Potomac, and the absence of cavalry rendered it impossible to obtain accurate information. In order, however, to retain it on the east side of the mountains, and thus leave open our communications with the Potomac, General Ewell had been instructed to send a division eastward. Unquote. Lee had heard nothing from the cavalry, and Lee wrote later that he assumed the enemy was still in Virginia. Cavalry was not available to gather intelligence on enemy movements, but General Longstreet had a spy that showed up with a report on the night of June 28. The spy's name was Henry Thomas Harrison, and if you want more information on Mr. Harrison, see the Wikipedia article about him. Henry Thomas Harrison. It was at 10 p.m. that Harrison met with Longstreet. So when Longstreet brought Harrison to see Lee, it would have been later than 10 p.m. Sears wrote that Harrison told General Lee that the Federal Army crossed the Potomac 3 days earlier and were now well up into Maryland. Harrison was able to report the location of 5 of the 7 Federal Corps. As of 24 hours ago, 3 of the 7 Corps were at Frederick, and 2 more were between Frederick and South Mountain. Let's compare that report to the map showing locations as of the morning of June 27. Here's Frederick. Harrison reported 3 at Frederick and 2 more between Frederick and South Mountain, unquote. That's not especially accurate, but the phrase, well up into Maryland, is reasonable. History tells us the last U.S. Corps crossed the Potomac into Maryland on June 27, but the basic punch to the alarm bell was right on. Lee saw that his army was scattered, and they needed in self-defense to rejoin. Let's look again at the dawn June 28 map. See where Lee's 3 corps were located on the morning of June 28. At first glance, maybe Ewell's corps out to the northeast was the top priority to get moving. Lee immediately that night sent a courier off to General Ewell at Carlisle. Coddington guesses Ewell received the order around 9 a.m. the next morning, the 29th, and there is no copy of that order available, but Coddington wrote that the message from Lee informed Ewell that Hooker had crossed the Potomac and directed him to return with his forces to Chambersburg, unquote. But then, apparently, Lee remembered the plan to draw the enemy east away from his line of communications. Lee's line of communications was down the Cumberland Valley to Hagerstown and Williamsport, and then across the Potomac back into Virginia. By the next morning, the 29th, Lee changed his mind. Maybe he reconsidered what the best response to the new threat was. Lee still wanted to cover his line of retreat and his supply line from Virginia. Lee still wanted to draw the enemy army to the east. Ewell's order would be changed. But I'm getting ahead of the story. On the night of June 28, the message sent to Ewell was to return to Chambersburg. Next, Chapter 3, June 29.